We're almost finished reading through the book of Deuteronomy, and that means that we're coming up to the time to start over again, right, for our readings. So next week we will have, Lord willing, I've got them printed off, I just didn't have them all finished, and put together booklets for the next 3 years for those of you that want to keep track of what the readings are and when the festivals are and all of that kind of thing. We'll have them on the back table. Today, however, on the back shelf there underneath the window, we have handouts to take with you for Sukkot. There's one little sheet that's the blessings, if you're interested in the traditional blessings while you're sitting in the sukkah. There's a handout there, and then there's also a little booklet which we're going to kind of go through a little bit this afternoon. It's traditional to read Ecclesiastes. Does that seem like the book you would want to read on a festival of rejoicing? Yes, in fact, the reason it became the tradition to read Ecclesiastes, or in the Hebrew it's called Kohelet, is because Kohelet helps us find out where real joy is, not the fake stuff that you have to manufacture that goes away real fast. So we will do that. We'll talk about that this afternoon. We may even read the whole book, just straight through, and then talk about it a bit while we're there, and that will give us a little prime the pump for what you're going to do. You know, when you're sitting in your sukkah and you have some friends, you can always say, hey, let's read part of Ecclesiastes and then talk about it, right? And so it'll kind of prime the pump for that. Now, this whole idea of dwelling together. I've had a number of people ask me recently, mostly on email, when do you think Jesus was born? Well, the answer to that is we can't tell for sure because I don't want to get into this at all too long. But as you know, every so often we have to add a 13th month to the year, right? We have Adar, but sometimes we have Adar 1 and Adar 2. And the reason we have to do that is to keep the lunar cycle on sync with the solar, right? Why do we have to do that? It tells us that we're supposed to, at Pesach, at Passover, we're supposed to wave the first sheaf of barley. That means Passover is tied to a season. What regulates the seasons? The sun, not the moon. In fact, if you go by the moon, you're about 11 days off or more a year, which means in 3 years you'd be a month off. Right? You bring that up on Shabbat? So, even though the Torah doesn't tell us exactly how to intercalate the year, it became obvious that you needed to add certain days to a year every so often in order to keep things in sync. Now, apparently they did that throughout the history of Israel, right up until the time of Yeshua. But the thing that we don't have is any record of which years they intercalated. And sometimes it appears that they intercalated or added a 13th month 3 years in a row to catch up where they were behind. So we could be 3 months off with our calculations. So people that tell you we know for sure what month Yeshua was born in, ask them for the data. I'd be very interested how they came to that conclusion. There may be one hint that John gives us. It's not a very significant hint, but at least it's a hint. You know the verse. It says, He came unto His own, and His own did not receive Him. But as many as received Him, to them He gave the right to become the children of God, even to those who believe in His name. Now it says, in the beginning was the Word. This is how the chapter starts out. Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning. And it goes on. Who's the Word? Yeshua, right. it says, now what verse am I looking for? It's verse 14, of course. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. When you read the Greek and you read the word dwelt, it's the word skenao. And it's the same Greek word that's used in the Septuagint for what do you think? Pardon me? Yeah, a sukkah, a hut. And some translations would say he tabernacled amongst us, because that was the King James Version way of translating sukkah, that is a tabernacle, a temporary kind of a dwelling place. Now, it could just be that word was used to talk about the fact that he came and dwelt in our place. But some might suggest that his birth was in some relationship to this festival of Sukkot, because he came to dwell with us in our place. That's possible. It's at least a wonderful time to consider Yeshua's birth and to consider what that means by way of his incarnation. Jake.
Yeah, I know. In 2 Peter, Peter says in his epistles, that I must soon put off this tent.
Right.
It's common. I guess it seems like it could also be a common way of saying your body.
Well, it is used. It's used not only in biblical Greek Septuagint, but also in non-biblical. Tent is used of the temporary dwelling, which would then be your body, because at one point, unless the Lord returns and takes us to Himself, our spirit will leave this body, and then the body will be resurrected later. Yeah.
And I've also at least. Not recently, but just over the last few years, I guess I found myself caring less and less per se when he was born. Although it would be cool, no doubt. That would be a perfect picture if it was tabernacles.
Right.
But would it be so bad if he was born around Christmas time?
No. There wasn't a Christmas when he was born.
But I'm saying sometimes there's this knee-jerk reaction in the Messianic movement to to reject it just because.
You don't have anything about the birth of the Messiah as being a Christian church remembrance until the 4th century. The first homily that was given was given in, if I remember correctly, right around 360. Chrysostom and I believe he was the first to give a homily at that time of the year. How they chose that time of the year is shrouded in history. We don't have. We can speculate, but that's about all we can do.
Right, maybe they messed with it to try to make it synchronize with other festivals as well. Maybe.
It would seem that that's the case.
Right.
It's even interesting in our own country, when you read in the colonies, the Puritans and others made it very clear: don't bring green boughs into your home at the festival of, and they had a festival that talked about the forest spirits, and the forest spirits were to be coaxed back into the forest, so that they would bring forth the spring and the renewing of the trees and so forth.
Right. It was the Puritans in the colonies.
And they said
they didn't do Christmas because they said it had the trappings of popery or whatever.
Yes. Well, it did, and that's because the Roman Catholic Church was the first to, as it were, canonize in their calendar. In their ecclesiastical calendar, a day to celebrate the birth of the Messiah. Now, I don't think we should shy at all from celebrating the birth of the Messiah, but to make a holiday out of it and to say it has to be done at this time, so forth and so on, I think we don't find any good historical evidence for that, except for what we see coming in the emerging Roman Catholic Church in the 4th century.
Right. I understand. I agree with exactly what you're saying, but maybe just slightly play devil's advocate. We do the same thing with Sukkot, how we count it, right? When really it could be one way or the other. It could be but we all corporately do it.
I hear that argument all the time, Jake, and it doesn't have any cogency with me, if you don't mind saying. If I don't want to offend you at all.
No, I'm not.
But yeah.
I haven't done Christmas for a long time.
People are saying, well, you should just cite the new moon. You should cite the new moon and go from there. This fixed calendar is something that the rabbis made. Okay, granted. Hillel II. When Yeshua was on the earth, what calendar did he follow? He followed the Sanhedrin calendar from everything we know. Was the Sanhedrin made up of wonderful people? No. Was the Sanhedrin made up of people who hated him? Yes. The Sanhedrin actually sanctioned his crucifixion, from everything we can tell. But what was Yeshua teaching us? The calendar is not a matter of individual decision. It was in the hands of leaders of the nation. And he followed it. And how do we know that? Every time he's in Jerusalem for a festival, it's full of people. It was the majority calendar. It wasn't the Essene calendar from Qumran. It wasn't the Sadducean calendar, which was a minority calendar. It had to be a majority calendar. Now, maybe this is too simple. If Yeshua was willing to follow a majority calendar, then I think we should do the same thing. And when he returns, if he tells us that the calendar that's being followed is wrong, we'll say, we'll do it your way. But my suspicions is that when he returns, he will help make the calendar what it should be if it's not already. And so I think, there's this movement within the larger Messianic movement and Hebrew Roots movement of individuals going off and saying, we're celebrating it now, we're celebrating it now, we're celebrating it now. And there's a sense in which that undermines community. Part of the festivals is community together, celebrating these appointed times of the Lord. And frankly, the Hillel 2 calendar is ingenious. And from everything we don't have a lot of history on this. Josephus says a bit, but Josephus, from what I've read and others, and this is in the later rabbinic literature, there were times when the Sanhedrin had to postpone the declaration of the new moon by 2 or 3 days. They just didn't have enough information. So if it's cloudy and you can't see the moon, how are you going to declare it? So they were willing to move a little bit one way or the other, and how could we dispute that if they were the authorities under which, if we were living in the first century, we would be submitting? So the final calendar that was made before Israel was entirely dispersed, the Hillel 2 calendar, does its best to keep a calendar on track with the solar calendar, and has done so for thousands of years. So I don't see any reason why we shouldn't say, well, let's use that.
Oh, no, I wasn't saying we should change our Sukkot time, but you made my point perfectly, because greater Christianity still acknowledges a certain date for his birthday, and you're saying that we should. So you're saying in your instance we should go along with the flow when it comes to the
No,
greater
I'm not saying
calendar.
that. I'm saying we should use Yeshua as our guide. He submitted to the Sanhedrin. He didn't submit to the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church is not the Sanhedrin. So what I'm saying is there is a majority opinion with regard to the calendar in the final Sanhedrin that existed under Hillel II, and I think that had Yeshua been on this earth, he would have said that's the calendar we should follow, just like he did with the Sanhedrin calendar in the first century. Even though the Sanhedrin, had to at times shifted a bit to keep up with the solar calendar. So that would be my take on it. I just think that I want to make it very clear. We don't have any problem with people celebrating the birth of the Messiah. But to celebrate it as a yearly festival at a given time, based upon what the emerging Roman Catholic Church decided would take place, at the same time disregarding the festivals that are clearly laid out in the Bible, I think is something we ought to avoid. Yeah, that's all. Okay, good discussion. So, Yeshua tabernacled with us. If we miss that for trying to figure out calendar issues, we miss the big picture. Okay, and I'm not saying we're doing it. I'm not saying our discussion previously was set in that mode. No, not at all. But what I'm saying is, when we're sitting in the sukkah, what is the point? Well, I don't know about your sukkah, but the sukkah we have doesn't have running water. sometimes we put a little wood stove out there if it gets real cold, but it's not insulated and it's not very comfortable if it's raining and if the wind is blowing. What's the point? The point is that Yeshua came from the perfect aspect of heaven, of communion with the Father. And he divested himself of his known glory. And he came and he dwelt in our place. A place that's marked by death. A place that's marked by sin. And he came. And so when we sit in that sukkah, the one thing we want to remember is Yeshua himself gave up. It's how did we become rich? By him becoming poor. That through his poverty we might become rich. He's willing to dwell with us in the most, mundane of places. And he dwells with us now, just as Gary was pointing out through his Spirit. And to me, that's one of the key issues of Sukkot. That he dwells with us. And he's going to dwell with us in the future, and we with him. And from everything that I can read, and again, just like Gary said, I'm not going to get into questions of eschatology here, but it appears quite clear to me, by Ezekiel and other passages, Isaiah, that Yeshua is going to dwell with us here upon this earth. Not only the new heavens and new earth, but on this earth. He's coming to be with us so that he can take us to be forever with him. And what does Paul say in Thessalonians? Therefore, comfort one another with these words. So, when we sit in the sukkah, we're experiencing kind of the tactile way of experiencing the fact that Yeshua is willing to dwell with us here. And he did so, and he will do so again. Let's turn our attention to the text that we read. It's a difficult text, actually. And I shouldn't, but I'm going to anyway, apologize for the technicalities that are in your handout. Sometimes when a person is working from the Hebrew, they have all kinds of questions, and then they spend a lot of time trying to answer those questions, and that becomes part of the notes. So, excuse the technicalities. As an overall point, isn't it interesting how important blessing someone is? Here's Moshe blessing each of the tribes. Well, we would presume each of the tribes. There's something about praying blessing upon another person, especially parents over children, or grandparents over grandchildren or children. God takes that seriously. And we see here that there are some true benefits for engaging in that kind of blessing. That's one of the things I think is so important about our Erev Shabbat times together, where a father or a mother will bless the children publicly and ask God to bless them and continue to bless them. So we start with the words of Moses, spoken as a blessing over the nation of Israel prior to his final ascent to the mountain on which he would die. Isn't it interesting? Moses anticipates and knows that his last day or days are short and ahead of him, just ahead of him, and yet he engages in what? Blessing others. Wouldn't you expect him to be a little bit self-centered at this point? He is a good example for us all, that as we face the final days, we know that we are safe if we are in the Messiah Yeshua. Facing the final days of his life, Moses turns his attention to the essential foundation of the Torah as the life and future for the nation he had led from the time of his divine appointment as their leader in Egypt. The section is composed of an introduction, the first 5 verses, describing the coming of Adonai from the region of Mount Sinai to protect and fight for Israel. And by the way, Yeshua, God, is not portrayed as some wimpy kind of a Oh, I'd just like to be your friend person. In this case, what is he portrayed as? A warrior, right? He's coming with power. It's composed of introduction and blessing over the tribes of Israel, comprising the body of his final words, and then praise of the Most High and his relationship to Israel as divine king and protector. The opening verse seems to indicate that the words of Moses which comprise this song of blessing were written down by someone else, since the language is cast in the third person. It says, "Now this is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the sons of Israel before his death. He said." Why doesn't it say, "I said"? Is Moses writing this or not? And this becomes a big point for the liberals to say, see, Moses didn't really write this. This was all put together much, much, much later, some even thinking as late as Hosea 600s. And that's why they say that the book of Deuteronomy proves to us that you can't trust the Bible. Wrong. Just because someone else took the words of Moses and penned them after he died doesn't mean that they're not the inspired text. We may surmise that this final blessing upon Israel by Moshe, our teacher, was recorded after his death, yet we may be certain that by divine assistance the record of Moses' final words is accurate and precise, being inspired by the Spirit of God. Yes?
Wouldn't it also be possible that Moses, the most humble of all men, never used first person I? Because
It is, but let me repeat this. Isn't it possible that he uses the third person because of his humility, and he's not talking about I and me and so forth? But in other parts of the Torah, he does say I. So, but look, I'm almost certain that there were notices of deaths that are written by someone else, right, after they die. And that this may have been the case for Moses. Now, it's possible that he could have written it before he died, but the way it's written, it sounds like that they heard this and then someone wrote it down as part of a eulogy for Moses. But even then, we would still presume, and rightly so, that the Spirit of God was carrying along the writer to make sure that what he wrote was accurate and what God intended. The introduction describes in poetic phrases the coming of Adonai from Mount Sinai and regions to the south with his myriad of troops called the Holy Ones. He is pictured as the divine warrior whose spear is a bolt of lightning. We have that same picture at the end of Habakkuk. However, the translation of the stone Tanakh, from his right hand he presented the fiery Torah to them, is based upon a marginal reading, a Koreh, noted by the Masoretes. The note in the Masorah says to read the difficult word, Eish dot, as two words, Eish and dot, which would yield fire of law. The Targum is the Aramaic kind of commentary on the Torah, has the writing of his right hand from the midst of the fire is the Torah he gave to us. Let me just, if I can interject here, could I just encourage you, if you're reading, the stone edition is rabbinic, right? The rabbis were the ones that put that Bible together. When you're reading rabbinic literature, you can almost be guaranteed that they will shift the translation to fit their interpretations. It's very common. Some might say, well, isn't the stone Chumash, maybe the Chumash means the 5 books, the stone Torah, isn't it one of the best translations because it's done by Jewish rabbis who know the Hebrew and so forth? I would say no. I would say it's interesting. I have a copy. I refer to it. I look at the footnotes and so forth. I think there's some interesting things to be gleaned from it. But I would be very careful because they are morphing the text or twisting the text or, shall we say, massaging the text to fit what they have already decided it should say. Now, I'm not saying they do that all the time, but it's not uncommon. So this is more a theologically driven translation than one that adheres to the literal sense of the words. The Septuagint has, on his right hand were angels with him, which may be the basis for several times in the Apostolic Scriptures where angels accompanying the giving of the Torah. We should accept the word, this rare word, Eish as a combination of Eish, fire, and one of several Semitic verbs that connote to throw or to shoot, as in Shadah. in Old Aramaic and Syriac, at any rate. And thus meaning to cast fire. And I take that to be a description of lightning, which is perfect parallelism. He came with a bolt of lightning in his hand. He thrusts it out. That's just an ancient Near Eastern picture of a warrior that has power more than anyone else. That's all. Pictures as Israel's defender, the Almighty, arrives with the weapon of lightning in his hand, perhaps symbolic of his own self-revelation in the Torah, the very essence of the covenant between himself and his people. The Torah embodies Israel's prime inheritance and is commanded to Israel because God loves the people who are identified as all your holy ones who are in your hand. Now, all of this is covenant language in which God, as a suzerain or a great king, chooses Israel as his vassal and commits himself to her as the one who would protect her and grant to her the blessings he had promised under oath. This picture of Israel being in his hand may help explain Isaiah 49:16. Behold, I have inscribed you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are continually before me. Now, I have looked and looked and looked at that verse over the years, trying to figure something out, what it might be. And a while back, some time ago, I was helping someone carry a whole lot of bricks. Actually, those stones that you use to build up a flower bed or something like that, the real heavy stones. I didn't have any gloves. And when I got done, I looked at my hands, and they were all marked, not scarred or cut, but all marked by the heavy load I was carrying. Have you ever carried something and it left a crease in your hands? I think that's what it's talking about in Isaiah, or at least possible, 49:16. I've carried you in my hands, and I have marks in my hands to prove it. You're inscribed. I've inscribed you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are continually before me. It's like a builder who has the marks of his work in his hands. Israel is therefore set apart, which is what we mean by holy, to him as the only nation with whom he has entered into covenant. Have you thought about that? There's no other nation. I'm not talking about individuals, and I'm not talking about people groups, but I'm talking about a nation, which is a people group. The only one that he's ever entered into covenant with is Israel. Amos 3:2, you only have I chosen from all the nations of the earth. He is king in Yeshurun. Yeshurun is another word for Israel. The name of Israel given to describe her sanctified status was in the covenant of Torah. Yeshurun means upright ones, as we find, for instance, in Isaiah 44:2. Thus, from the beginning of the blessings Moses would give to Israel after his death, or before his death, he focuses on the great gift of God's self-revelation, particularly in giving them his Torah. As Israel's inheritance, it is her prime possession. It connotes something vital and cherished. Isn't that so interesting that in our day, and after a couple almost millennia of the Christian church saying that the Torah is a burden and a curse and so forth and so on. In fact, in the first edition of the Schofield Study Bible, the footnote, I remember this from reading it many years ago, when the Torah was given and Israel responded, all that you have said we will do, Schofield wrote in his note saying, that was a harsh response which they should not have given, because they should have known they couldn't do it. That God gave the Torah to Israel as proof that they couldn't keep it. Well, that doesn't sound like what we read in Psalm 119. Your decrees are my eternal inheritance. They are my heart's delight. Now, Psalm 119, verse 111. You see, when we say the Torah is our delight, we're not boastfully saying we keep it perfectly. We cannot do that. But part of keeping the Torah is to seek repentance when we sin. And God said, when we seek repentance, He will forgive through the blood of His Son, Yeshua. Because verse 4 is such a succinct and pithy expression of God's love to Israel in giving the Torah, as well as expressing the great value of the Torah to Israel, the sages chose it along with the first verse of the Shema as the first biblical verses to be taught to a child when he or she is able to speak. That's just a tradition, probably very late. The order of the tribes listed within the blessings of Moses is as follows: Reuben, Judah, Levi, Benjamin, Joseph, which includes Ephraim and Manasseh, Zebulun, Issachar, Gad, Dan, and Naphtali, and Asher. Shimon is not mentioned. Did you notice that? And this was considered problematic by some ancient scribes, as we might think. They left out a tribe. The Septuagint adds a blessing for Shimon in verse 6. The Septuagint adds, "And let Shimon be many in number." Others have suggested that the blessing for Shimon is alluded to in the opening words of verse 7. Here, Shema Adonai, since these are the words of Leah explaining Shimon's name. For she names him Shimon because God has heard my cry. Right. And that the blessing somehow dropped out during generations of copying the manuscripts. But this is unlikely, indeed I think impossible. And there are no indications in the various Hebrew manuscripts, including the Dead Sea Scrolls. Isn't it nice that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls? And if you don't know, there's a website, the Dead Sea Scroll website. You can, whatever manuscripts they have there, you can go there and click on it, and you can zoom it up, and you can keep zooming it up and look at individual letters if you want to. They've done some really good photography in that. So if you look all the way through Qumran, wherever you find Deuteronomy 33, you won't find any additions that include Simon or Shimon. So there's no Hebrew original that contained a blessing for Shimon. It would seem that the Septuagint is simply attempting to correct what it saw as an obvious omission. Frankly, I don't think there are any satisfying explanations for the omission. I can't come up with any. I don't know exactly why. Simeon had a lot of hard times. Yeah. I think we can make a speculation, though, that since Simeon's territory was within that of Judah's, and we can read that in Joshua 19 and Judges 1, and since Simeon was a small tribe, that Simeon simply shared in Judah's blessing, just as Ephraim and Manasseh shared in the blessing given to Joseph, right? Because they were the sons of Joseph. The impetus for leaving out the name may have been the need to arrive at the number 12 for the tribes, Joseph being represented by his two sons. More important, perhaps, is the order in which the tribes are listed. Reuben is restored to his place as firstborn, even though the blessing of the firstborn had apparently passed to Judah in the Joseph narrative. Since Judah stands as surety for Benjamin, Reuben's selfish attempts are apparently disregarded in lieu of Judah's willingness to offer himself. You remember when they were leaving Joseph to die and whatever. Yet, though the historical birth order is highlighted, Judah's blessing shows clearly that he stands in a prominent position. And why? Why does Judah stand in a prominent position in this blessing and in other places too? Lineage. And is there an important person coming from Judah? Yes, Yeshua, our Messiah. The blessings themselves are essentially an expansion of the various names given to the sons, or a prayer for the success of their respective duties and positions within the nation. Reuben's blessing is a prayer that though his numbers would be few, he yet would survive. However, Reuben's population is not notably small in the census of Numbers 1 and 26. Some have suggested that Gad, who is said to be enlarged, may have assimilated some of Reuben's territory. Judah's blessing contains a curious line: "Hear, O Lord, the voice of Judah, and bring him to his people." What is meant by bring him to his people? Does this allude to the ruler of Jacob's original blessing? Right? He says that the ruler's staff will not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. And who is this Shiloh figure? The picture seems to be of a warrior who has left to do battle, and thus a prayer of blessing for his return is offered. This would fit the picture of Judah with a scepter and ruler's staff as found in Genesis 49:10. So who is the one individual that best exemplifies the tribe of Judah? It is the Messiah. And the Messiah has gone. Is he coming again? Yes. Of course, he was coming for the first time and I think the promise here alludes to that and fits well with Genesis 49, verse 10. Levi is given the duty of teaching the Torah to the people and representing the people in the priestly functions. The Tumim and Urim, only here in this order, usually it's Urim and Tumim. We don't know what they were exactly. They were some device by which the priest could discern the will of God for the people in specific situations, especially when there wasn't a lot of time to think about it. The exact function and even the name itself is less than certain. But the Urim and Tumim are mentioned first to show the vital function of the Levites in leading the people according to God's direction. Your godly man refers to Levi, the father of the tribe, and thus representative of the whole. The text says that the Levites were proved at Massah, and that they were contended with at Meribah. It appears that Moses is speaking of times when the Levites remained faithful to God, while the majority of the people forsook him. Such was the case at the golden calf incident, as well as the Baal Peor debacle, but neither of these happened at the places mentioned in our text. Rather, at Massah and Meribah, the people murmured against Moses and Aaron. Reference is made to the trials at Massah and at the water of strife, according to Keil and Delitzsch, on the principle that the Lord humbles his servants before he exalts them and confirms those that are his by trying and proving them. Some have suggested that Massah, where the bitter waters were, and so forth, and Meribah, were chosen because they represented the beginning and end of the Israelite journey by which the Levites were tested. Verse 9 describes the Levites as disregarding close family relationships. Now, is that something to praise somebody for? Well, we have to get it in context. I think this must refer to the fact that as the judges, the Levites could give no special treatment to family members. In other words, the typical political patting each other on the back that we see so often in our days was not to be the case with the Levites. The Levites were to render judgment according to what the testimonies and facts would prove. Thus, at the golden calf incident, the Levites followed Moses' order to execute the guilty, whether son, brother, neighbor, or kin. I can't imagine that. I mean, you would have to have a heart that was really given over to God in a way that would not be tempered or changed by one's inner feelings. In parallel language, Yeshua teaches that to be his disciple, one must be willing to put him before father and mother, son or daughter. Right? Fortunately, not all of us have had to deal with that, but some of us have. When oftentimes in Jewish community, if a Jewish, religious Jewish person comes to faith in the Messiah, they are cut off from their family and cut off from their community. And they experience what Yeshua said, that to love me, you must love me in advance and in a greater way than even your father and mother and your own family. It doesn't mean we shouldn't love our family with all the love that we possibly could, but it means there is a priority in love. And this is something that our society has lost. I was listening to the news yesterday as I was making some errands, and it was amazing to me how, in fact, I was passing by a church nearby, and on the reader board it says, "Love lets everyone in and does not build walls." Well, that's not the love that God talks about. Right. I mean, even in the text that we had here, and in the text that we read from Jude, there is a time coming when there's going to be judgment. And the love of God will be displayed ever as much as ever before. But his love does not overturn his righteousness and his holiness. Nor does his holiness and righteousness overturn his love. How do we know that? Because in order to love us with the love of eternity, he sent his Son to die for us so that his righteousness and justice could be and would be satisfied. So we have to kind of, I don't know how to say it, we have to strengthen ourselves against the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, and keep bringing it next to the Scriptures and aligning it and say what is right and what is wrong when we hear so much like this in our society.
Yeah, I was just going to say, how would we know what was right or wrong if somebody didn't put some boundaries about what was? And so then, if there's the boundaries, we'd know.
Yeah. Yeah, you would think that the modern...
There's nobody's even called to any righteousness if they don't
Right,
think there is any
right,
wrongness.
right. So, I've talked with people even recently who are saying, just accept everyone, let's just coexist. And I say, well, if I say, no, I don't want to coexist, will you still accept me? And they look at you kind of funny like, what? Why wouldn't you want to coexist? Well, I think it's right. We said it in our Yom Kippur service. There's a time when there's going to be a society that all has the same mind. It's the world to come, right? In the new heavens and the new earth, when we exist there with our Savior Yeshua, there's not going to be anybody who is going to be doing what is wrong. Everyone is going to agree with Him. We will be made new. It's going to be amazing, isn't it? There has to be boundaries, or we can't even talk to each other. As one who loves to study languages, the whole point of language is that you have words with discrete meanings. There's boundaries. We can't make a word just mean whatever we want it to mean whenever we want it to mean something different. We would not be able to communicate. This is what happened in the Tower of Babel, right? I'm going to go out and buy a new tree tomorrow. And what I'm thinking in my head, tree is car. And when I tell you I'm going to go buy a new tree tomorrow, you go, oh, really? Can I come over and help you plant it? I said, no, you don't get it. We can't even talk to each other if words don't have boundaries. And that's what's happening in our day. Vocabulary is being taken away from us because we can't use certain words anymore the way that we would normally use them. So to the priests of the Levitical tribe was given the duty and privilege of teaching the commands and precepts of the Lord to the people. Parallel to their teaching responsibilities was that of presenting offerings to the Lord upon the brazen altar, as well as burning the incense on the golden altar. Thus their Godward ministries are combined with those directed to the people. One could not stand without the other. Do you understand what I'm saying here? It's not just the sacrifice, it's the sacrifice for and with regard to the people and with regard to their lives. This principle may be applied to all teachers of God's truth. A recognition of the holiness and majesty of God must always be the primary and requisite foundation from which one's teaching proceeds. All right, the prayer of blessing for Levi, and thus the priests chosen from this tribe, is twofold: that their service at the altars would be accepted, and secondly, that their enemies would be scattered. The enemies of the priests, who would these be? Might be understood either as the enemies of Israel generally, or as those within Israel who murmured against them in their service. In either case, the enemies of those who are chosen to minister before the Lord and to the people are the enemies of God as well. Again, quoting Hegg, the verse does not necessarily refer to physical assault. The Psalms often describe verbal attacks and false accusations hyperbolically as physical danger, right? When David says, the wicked are saying lies about me. Their words pierce me. So it's almost like he's in battle, but it has to do with their attacks upon him. The Psalms often describe verbal attacks and false accusations hyperbolically as physical danger. The Levites' enemies could be those who would challenge their exclusive right to priesthood, as Korah and tribal chieftains challenged Aaron's right. In other words, who gave you, I want to go give a sacrifice on the altar. What did God say about a non-Levite who approaches the altar? Yes. That's a pretty severe penalty, don't you think? And it ought to be, because the priesthood was a foreshadow of Yeshua. And you cannot replace Yeshua. You can't do what he alone could do. All right, Benjamin is a lamb carried on the shoulders of Adonai, the divine shepherd. This may relate to the fact that Saul, the first king of Israel, was from the tribe of Benjamin, or it may hearken back to the words of Jacob, who portrayed Benjamin to his brothers as one specially loved, to which God himself agrees, for Benjamin is Yedid Adonai, the beloved of Adonai, and thus receives his special protection. The idea of being carried between, which is the Hebrew word bain, the shoulders, and this is how they would carry, right? A lamb, back legs, front legs, over the shoulders like that. You've probably seen pictures. So the idea of being carried on the shoulders may be a play on the first syllable of the name, Bain, as in Benjamin, son of the right hand. A lot of this is poetic, and that just makes... You know what makes good poetry? When you can memorize it easily, right? And it sticks with you. All right. Joseph receives the longest of the blessings and the most universal, and stands for the two tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. The blessing of Joseph, which involves the fertility of the ground in producing crops, may be derived from the name Joseph. What may he increase? It means to add or to increase. And Ephraim, God has made me fertile. The word bounty, megid, characterizes the blessing, being found 5 times. The word gerish is used only here, and its given meaning crop is derived from its parallel to the former lines. The plural moons most likely is a poetic equivalent of months and refers to the cycle of the agricultural year. But the bounty of crops contains a metaphoric sense of general blessing, and particularly the blessing of God's presence, as the phrase, the favor of him who dwelt in the bush, makes plain. For Moses to use this reference harkens back to his own encounter with the Eternal One, and the revelation of the name as encompassing God's covenant relationship with Israel. You're walking along in the desert, and all of a sudden there's this bush that's burning and doesn't burn up. And you're thinking, what's going on here? And then you encounter God, who says, take your sandals off. The ground you're on is holy. And that's where he gives to him his name. Right? I will be what I will be. Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I will always be the same. Which means what? When I promise I will be with you, I can keep that promise, because I never change. Joseph's blessing extends to the ends of the earth, meaning that his dominance would overcome even the remotest of enemies and would eventually encompass all of the nations, in fulfillment of the original Abrahamic promise that in you all the families of the earth would be blessed. Zebulun and Issachar are noted for their riches. Though the heading names only Zebulun, the blessing includes Issachar, since these two neighboring tribes had close associations. So we can have another reason why we can see Simeon being gathered together with Judah. The wealth of these tribes comes from their maritime activities. Through their international commerce, wealth will be brought to the mountain, most likely referring to the building of the temple on Mount Zion, where sacrifices would be offered. Traditional rabbinic midrash saw the maritime activity of Zebulun as supporting Issachar, who would remain in your tents, taken to mean in the academies, where they would occupy themselves with the Torah. So this is how the rabbis get you to put money in the box. They say, look what Issachar, look what Zebulun did for Issachar. Zebulun gave them money so they didn't have to work, so they could be scholars, and so forth and so on. Well, it's a nice story. Don't know that it has any history. The phrase hidden treasures of the sand may refer to the calazon, from which the techelet dye is derived, used in the blue of the tabernacle garments of the high priest and the blue of the tzitzit. That could refer to gold too. You find gold in sand and so forth and so on, but that's at least one idea. Gad means fortune and has the tribe that settled in the fertile pasture lands of the Transjordan. The phrase choose for himself the best could mean the best in terms of agricultural land, or it could be first in the sense of the region first conquered by Israel. The idea of the leaders or heads of the people gathering and the execution of the justice of Adonai could refer to Dan's request, which was granted, that he settle in the Transjordan with the provision that he, along with the Reubenites, would fight to gain the land for the other tribes. So it could mean the first land that was settled. The name Dan is related to a Semitic root to judge, din. You've heard of a Beit Din, house of judgment? Okay, same basic root. Others conjecture a root meaning container or barrel. He is represented as a lion's whelp, meaning that he would grow in strength even as a young lion grows and learns the skill of the hunt. Naphtali, from the verb patal, to wrestle, possessed the fertile region in the upper Galilee, which was well watered and rich in woods, fruit trees, and many varieties of vegetation. It included the western and southern shore of Lake Tiberias. Thus, Naphtali was known for his fishing industry, according to some historical, or if we can accept the Targum as having some history. Asher means blessing, and this blessing is derived from his name, right? Asher, to be blessed or to bless. He will dip his foot in oil, which doubtlessly refers to the production of olive oil, well attested in the highlands of the Galilee. The blessing also asks for the protection of the northern region as though locked with bolts of iron or bronze on a fortress gate. The final description of God is wrapped up in his connection to Israel. No other nation has a covenant with God as does Israel. His divine protection is therefore upon Israel, whom he will defend against the nations. It's an interesting study to try to see the history of how the emerging Christian church and then the evolving Christian church and the Roman Catholic Church and then some of the other Christian churches that divided away, how they came to the idea that the Old Testament was no longer relevant to the Christian in his or her walk. I've not been able to find what I consider to be a single thread that goes through all of that and answers the questions. And frankly, even when you come up to the time of the Reformation, if you read the Westminster Confession of Faith, it never ever says that the law has been abolished. In fact, it says that the law is established. But you can always redefine the law, right? You know how the Torah was divided into three different kinds, right? Moral, civil, and ceremonial, right? And the civil and the ceremonial have been done away with, and the moral is retained. Well, you just can't find it. I have asked some friends who are top of the line scholars and well published and so forth and teach in universities, ask them, is the Sabbath commandment moral, civil, or ceremonial? And the answer is yes. Thank you, Douglas. Yes. But why? Because how is it moral? Because according to what God laid down in the Torah, someone who violates the Torah receives what punishment? That means it has morality connected to it. If the capital punishment, right? How is it civil? Well, you're not supposed to do your everyday work, right? You're supposed to suspend your common work on this day. How is it ceremonial? You're supposed to gather. According to Leviticus 23, it's one of the days of gathering. Now, immediately somebody's going to say, well, what about all my Christian brothers and sisters and family who don't keep Sabbath? And they go, none of us keep Sabbath perfectly. Okay? God is gracious and God is patient. And his patience brings us to what? Repentance, according to Paul. So I don't know God's time frame in this regard, but I think we should reconsider, because it becomes very easy for us in our way of doing things to become kind of perfunctory we just do it. We don't think about it anymore. We should make the Sabbath a day that's different than the other 6 days as best we're able to do. Granted, there's always times when we're going to have to do various things. Yeshua himself was castigated for doing good on the Sabbath, right? For healing on the Sabbath. And so, no, we're not getting into rabbinics here, but we're saying that we're to make the day different than the other days, and we're to do it as unto the Lord, not as just part of a religious activity. We're to do it unto the Lord. So, Asher means blessing. This blessing is derived from his name, and it has to do probably with the bounty of olive trees and the olive oil that they would get from that region. No other nation has God made covenant with Israel. That should tell us that if we ever were to discount God's promise to Israel, we have misread the Scriptures. Only in Israel is this protection to be realized, for the God of Israel has everlasting arms of protection, that is, arms which never grow weary, in contrast to Moses' arms, which did grow weary and were in need of assistance. Right? Remember when he was lifting his arms up and somebody had to hold him up? Those who, like Ruth, come under the wings of the Almighty, find lasting and omnipotent protection, but this haven of refuge is found only for Israel. Once again, the covenant people of Israel form the locus or the location of God's salvation. Only Israel finds that chosen place of covenant among all the peoples of the earth, and thus only Israel is a people saved by Adonai. This means that the elect from the nations, whom God has determined to save, must inevitably find their covenant membership and self-identity in Yeshua, and through him, their membership in the people called Israel. It doesn't make us change our ethnicity. It doesn't change our nationality. But Israel, remember, Paul teaches us in Romans 9, not everyone descended from Israel is Israel. Right? Esau is not Israel. So can we be grafted in? Yes. And is this the promise that God made, that in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed? So I guess the bottom line, to say it in a short way, supersessionism or replacement theology has no place in real biblical theology when it comes to salvation. It would take away the promise, period. You're exactly right. And this is where we must see the tie together, that the Bible is one single whole. Now granted, there's much in the Torah we cannot obey at this time, but we have hearts to if we could and if we were able. The Haftarah continues the overarching theme of the glory of the Torah as central to Israel's own identity. Success comes not by one's own prowess or acumen, but by knowing and applying the divine precepts of the Torah. Such is gained through constant study and application of the inspired words of God. In similar fashion, the Epistle of Jude admonishes the people to hold fast to the what? Faith that was once for all handed down to the saints or the holy ones. Was Abraham saved the same way you and I are saved? Yes, he looked ahead and put his faith in the coming Messiah. David, Moses, all the rest who were true believers put their faith in the coming Messiah. There's one gospel. There's one salvation. There's one faith. And it's not different from age to age. We're not to be misled by those who cause division by despising authority and giving in to fables and myths rather than holding to the word of the apostles of Yeshua. This is a reminder to us here in our own movement. Ask the hard questions. That's why I love, questions that come when we're talking here. Where does it say that? How do we know that? Ask the hard questions. Seek to know the answers from the Scriptures. In verse 14, Jude quotes from Enoch. Actually, he doesn't quote. There's no manuscript of Enoch that has the exact words that Jude says here. Well, who in turn alludes to our Torah text, in which God comes with the myriad of his army to execute justice against his enemies. Jude uses this reference to remind his readers that the Holy One is not to be trifled with, and as an admonition to remain faithful to the truth. The footnote, I simply say that Jude paraphrases a line from Enoch. Enoch was a very commonly read text, even in the first century, as we can tell, and maybe a century or two before. It was well known, and it's an apocryphal work, but the fact that he alludes to it does not give this apocryphal work a canonical status. It's not the Bible. Even quoting a source does not imply that the source as a whole is trustworthy. Paul, for instance, quotes from pagan Greek authors. In Acts 17, he quotes from Aratus. In Titus 1:12, he quotes from Epimenides. And in 1 Corinthians 15, he quotes from Meander. No one, on the basis of these quotes, would suggest that Paul considered these works of Greek philosophers or poets to be canonical. Though Enoch was a well-known and much-read work in the early centuries, it never was accepted either by the rabbinical authorities nor by the apostles and later Christian church as canonical scripture. So if somebody says to you, if you're in a slight debate and they're saying, well, your Bible isn't inspired unless you accept Enoch, because Jude quotes from Enoch as though it's inspired text. No, he just quotes. It would be similar to if I were to say, if the Death Star came over someday, what are we going to do? I'm not thinking that there's such a thing as a Death Star. It's just something that's a picture in a movie that everyone might resonate with, right? So, yeah. Okay.